Hello and welcome to our discussion on budgeting for your TPRM program. I'm Peter Pinter, CMO of CyberGRX and moderator for our discussion today. And I'm thrilled to be joined by two very experienced TPRM practitioners, Stephanie Hart, partner at PwC, and Dave Stapleton, CISO at CyberGRX. Let me introduce them for you. Stephanie is a partner within PwC's consulting solutions practice, and she specializes in cybersecurity risk management and third-party security. And she brings multiple years of first-hand experience in helping organizations address their third-party risks within increasingly interconnected supply chains. Stephanie leads global teams of professionals in developing, implementing, and executing broad cyber risk and third-party security risk management capabilities, focusing on adopting emerging technologies and new approaches to increase assurance and drive efficiencies. Her work spans multiple industries, but she has a particular focus on pharma, life sciences, and high technology. She holds a Master of Business Administration from the University of Pittsburgh with a focus on supply chain management and information systems. Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Stephanie and I are joined by Dave Stapleton. Dave has appeared on some of our webinars in the past, so you may be familiar with him, but he is our CISO. He's a cybersecurity risk professional with over a decade of experience in both the public and private sectors. He began his cyber career at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he developed and managed risk and compliance teams, and he led government-wide cloud security initiatives on behalf of the executive branch. Dave is currently the Chief Information Security Officer at CyberGRX, where he focuses on the implementation and efficacy of internal cybersecurity and privacy programs, as well as market-facing brand ambassadorship. Dave is a certified information systems security professional, and it's a pleasure to have you back with us on the podcast today, Dave. So I am super excited about this particular topic. The timing of it could hardly be better. Here we are coming up towards the turn of the year. Many organizations are doing their 2023 planning and budgeting right now. And given our current economic climate, the pressure is on to reduce spending. And many CISOs are having to fight for budget dollars and justify their requests, perhaps where in prior years, those requests were less challenged, shall we say. So today, we are here to talk about the challenges facing security leaders and risk leaders, strategies to address those challenges, and how to fund the programs that you feel are needed to adequately protect your organization. And one of the things that we like to do on these webinars is to get audience participation. So we're going to start with a quick audience poll so that we can get to know who's with us on the call today, and we can tailor our discussion and commentary accordingly. So you should be seeing now on your screen a poll for your job function. We just like you to tell us your role in TPRM budgeting. Are you a security professional? Are you in risk management? Are you in procurement or in finance or in something else? And if you are in something else, please do post in the chat so that we can take note of that and include you in the conversation today. So perhaps we can let people fill out the poll, and while they're doing that, get the conversation started here. I think it's fair to say that the problem that we're facing, as we've just outlined, is not just one of budgeting, but actually a recognition that the landscape confronted by security professionals is continually changing. Ransomware is continuing to be on the rise, and as we are all acknowledging, ransomware is becoming a business in its own right, complete with investors and job boards and challenges in recruiting bad actors and many other facets which are fascinating, but not the focus of our call today. But something much closer to home for all of us is phishing. And phishing attempts have become more sophisticated. We have always identified employees as the #1 attack surface, and so it continues to be. As it happens, third-party adoption is chasing that same unfortunate goal of becoming the single biggest vector exploited by bad actors today. The reality is that all of these represent an enormous amount of risk. And with expanding attack surfaces, security leaders need to invest appropriately and, I think very importantly, have confidence that the right programs are getting funded. So with that all being said, do we have some results from our poll? Thank you very much for sharing those. So it looks as if we are targeting our webinars appropriately. We were desirous to speak with security and risk professionals, and indeed, so we have. So we've got one or two others noted in the chat. so we can actually, I'm not in a position to see the chat, but others others in the team are. So we're assuming those were either not posted or we will get to that later on. So we're talking to the right people and we're talking hopefully about the right subject. So we have a second poll to get us going here, which is around adequate resources to protect your organization. Two questions we'd like you to answer at this point. Do you feel that you have adequate resources to protect your organization now? Please answer either yes or no. Maybe would be highly suspect. In our 2023 budgeting, second question, where are you investing the most? So as you think about the choices that we're going to be talking about today, where are you leaning today as a priority for your organization? So this is just a subjective view of where you are choosing to place your, as it were, funding bets for the year. And with all that valuable information to hand, we can get this conversation underway. So maybe we can just start, Dave, with you as our CISO on the call directly. How does your organization prioritize third-party risk as a program? And has that prioritization changed over the last year to cause you to think differently about how to invest in this particular area for next year relative to where you were a year ago?
Yeah, well, as an employee of CyberGRX, it probably comes as no surprise, maybe I'm a little biased, that third-party risk has always been a top priority for us. I think in the broader market, sometimes there's a temptation to lean too heavily on the concept of the shared responsibility model. The idea that, well, I know it's a big risk and a lot of cyber attacks originate with third parties, but they have their own security teams and they have a responsibility to be working on this. And I've got all these other things that I need to work on. So maybe I'm going to let that kind of skate by a little bit longer than I otherwise would, just because I know that presumably there's some other security professional on the other end of this relationship that's also trying to help me secure this information in these environments. My personal belief is that that obviously we can't depend on that. It is a shared responsibility model, not a single responsibility model. We both organizations who are kind of our customer persona, as well as those that are the third party or the vendor, have a real responsibility to work together to create this more secured environment for the processing and storage of our data. I would say that digital transformation, which has significantly ramped up, particularly with the advent of COVID and changing workspace kind of models and formats, has significantly increased the dependency that we have on third parties. We entrust them with more sensitive and critical data. The processes that they run for us are increasingly more critical to the success of our business. I was just on a very large multi-organization, multi-agency disaster recovery simulation earlier today, and we were talking about this. Does anyone really ask themselves, what do I do if AWS goes down? It seems far-fetched and impossible, but the point of it was to illustrate that we depend on these third parties in really, really significant ways. And if there is a compromise of either confidentiality, integrity, or availability, the three kind of pillars of cybersecurity, there would be a very obvious and material impact on our organization. So for me, third-party risk has always been kind of in the top three kind of priorities of the things that I'm focused on from a security perspective.
And Dave, just briefly, change year over year. What's different now from where you were a year ago as you think about priorities? And then we're going to ask Stephanie to represent all the clients that she talks to. So here's our sample size of one. Dave, what's changed for you year over year?
The biggest thing that's changed is the volume. Just the rapid expansion of the utilization of third-party vendors, which creates a concentration risk in this sort of third-party space. We have just a plethora of SaaS platforms that provide specialized services that are really enticing to the business. And so I think the biggest thing that's changed for me over the past year has just been the volume of third parties that we're trying to manage.
Thank you, Dave. And Stephanie, is that something you're seeing across your client portfolio, the companies that you get to work with? Is that the single biggest change for them, or are there other things that are affecting the way that they're thinking about budgeting?
Yeah, I would say more companies are leveraging more third parties. It's generally quicker to get to market by buying a product or services than developing it yourself. And the types of services they need are not usually in their core competencies, especially in digital and technology. Manufacturers and healthcare companies and even banks, they don't develop apps, right? They buy them.
Right.
So for them to meet market demands, they have to go out into the market to get what they need.
Other things that are driving sort of prioritization of third-party risk as a program, Stephanie, and the clients that you work with, is it becoming a top 3 priority? Is it already a top 3 priority? What are you seeing there?
Can I give the classic consulting answer of it depends?
You can, but do we have to pay for it?
So what we're seeing is there's certain industries, that for 10, 20 years, third-party risk has been top of mind at the board level, at the C-suite level, right? That's been in financial services since some of the big regulations in the early 2010s, I'll say. But where the shift is, where this risk is elevating, is in other industries. We're seeing a lot more prevalent concern by the boards, healthcare companies for sure, what we call high tech, so the San Francisco giants over there, and even industries that you never would have expected, like oil and gas or consumer markets. All that's starting to become a little, third-party risk is starting to get up there on the agenda, I would say.
Yeah, I think we're hearing it as something which is becoming a bigger concern for folks. And so the question leads naturally to, well, does that mean we should be spending more on it? And is it required that we spend more money on it? And we're going to get into some of the sort of the puts and takes as far as the budgets are concerned. But before we get into that, I was just wondering about specifically the current economic climate and the evolving threat landscape. It's almost a conjunction of 2 terrible things at the same time. We've got this downward pressure macroeconomically suggesting that more caution is required from a budgeting point of view. And yet we have at the same time adversaries that seem to be, innovating rapidly, marshalling their forces and being effective at penetrating the defenses that we have been building around our organizations. I'm wondering about, what you're seeing in terms of that impact, again, Stephanie, from your perspective and your clients, and what are the kind of considerations and risks that your clients are talking through or asking you to help them think through around how to respond to those 2 forces impacting on their organizations?
Yeah, I would say going into the 4th quarter of the calendar year, the organizations I work with, we're seeing the compression. They're restricting their budgets. They're planning for whatever recession we're going to call this with an undetermined amount of length. I think we all kind of expected to hit that a little bit earlier in 2022, and we didn't. And now it's coming full force. So they're, generally big cost centers like IT, security, third-party security are deprioritized, right? Because they want the revenue generating functions to get the budgets. So it leaves organizations quite vulnerable right now, and adversaries take advantage of that. So they know the opportunity exists right now. How are organizations dealing with that? I think they're doubling down on the capabilities they have. What they're really trying to understand is, I'll say, cyber resilience in their supply chain and overall resilience, right? How do they fortify themselves more with what they have today without asking for more funding? Given the macroeconomic environment, how do they do more with less is really the kind of requests we're getting. How do I optimize my program to scale or to get a little bit deeper into some of my suppliers without having to ask for a significant amount more money?
And that might mean displacing budgets or moving money around within a budget to optimize for that environment. And we're certainly seeing innovation across the board being ways to address impossible problems. In fact, necessity being the mother of invention, we should expect there to be innovation coming as a result of that type of compression, shouldn't we? So we'll get into some of that sort of, well, what are the opportunities and how do we deliver that within the context of maybe a very rigid structure for our overall budgets. But I wonder, Dave, turning to you, as you think about budgeting for 2023 and specifically for your third-party risk management program, what are the big areas to plan for? And we're going to poll, get your perspective, and then we're going to take a look back and see how our audience is thinking about areas of priority. But given that we're not leading the witness here, give us your perspective, Dave. What are you on? How do you think about planning for your program?
So I'm gonna, Stephanie, I don't know, maybe I would make a good consultant, because I'm going to start off by saying it depends. It is based on need and risk. And those factors may change over time, and certainly they're going to vary for different types of organizations. But here at CyberGRX, some of the steps that we go through for that kind of budgeting is to really pull in our business units and understand what is the need for these third parties, what volume are we expected, to see what growth are we looking forward to over the next year or 2 years, if we can get that kind of forecasting. And then we break this entire process down into phases. How do we identify and maintain this inventory of these third parties? How do we appropriately risk rank them such that we know what level of rigor, if you will, to apply to assessment and evaluation? How much time are we going to spend on working with them to create corrective action plans for unacceptable risks? And then what does our kind of continuous monitoring, threat monitoring, breach monitoring program look like? All of those phases carry a cost. And so the way that I typically would look at it is, where do we have the most need? If we're a more nascent third-party risk management program, perhaps that identification and early inventory maintenance is the biggest thing. So do we have discovery tools that we might want to implement that will allow us to automate some of that process and see who we're communicating with, who we're purchasing from, that kind of thing. But as you move through the maturity, I guess, cycle of third-party risk management, different aspects will become more relevant, a higher impact, higher priority for you. So at some point, and I've not seen a tool yet that can do all of this, particularly around the management of the risk. So developing those corrective action plans and tracking those down and working with your third parties to understand what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, validating the types of controls that they put in place to address those risks. A lot of that is very manual, very human powered. And as we know, humans, particularly humans who are skilled in cybersecurity, are quite the premium these days. Hard to find and recruit, hard to retain, significant budgetary considerations for the number of people that you require for your team. So different buckets or areas that I would be focused on based on where the maturity of my program is. One of the biggest in any situation is going to be, how much am I spending specifically on the payroll for the team?
And how to address the issue of either availability of talent or the inability to expand that team to carry a wider set of responsibilities as the organization evolves. Great points, Dave. And I'm wondering, Stephanie, as you're listening to that, are there other areas that come to your mind where you'd say, actually, what we see a lot of clients ask for help in is in a particular, another area of their business? And we'll get the polling results out perhaps at this point as well. We can see what it tells us and maybe get your reactions to that. So here we go. Most people feel that they don't have adequate resources. Well, that probably isn't coming as a huge shock. I mean, I'm thrilled to see that 20% of our audience actually feel that they do have enough resources, which is awesome. And so the question then becomes how best to utilize those resources, and we'll get into that. But where are people investing the most? Well, it looks to me as if it's really about automation or tools. Software comes to the top. Fortunately, no one thinks that hardware is the right way to solve this problem, which is exciting. But as we can see, people are up there, second sort of highest ranked. And it seems that there are some other things that people feel we should be talking about. If we're not talking about them, please put them in the chat, and then we can address those live on the call together today. So Stephanie, any surprises from those results? Is that in line with your experience? What are your reactions?
No, this is in line. I don't think most people are not trying to hire a ton of people, given the premiums that are on cybersecurity related resources right now and their availability to choose. They can pretty much go to anywhere at the moment. So getting the best talent can be difficult without having to pay premium prices. So what's your second choice? It's using technology to make your processes more efficient, faster, and more intelligent. And, you know, a lot of our clients are asking us to come in and help do that very thing, that very thing. How do I make my process more efficient? How do I leverage the intelligence tools, the workflow tools, different perspectives on even their risk appetite is shifting. So what we would have cared about in our supplier, you know, risk rating methodology is shifting, so that they can go a little bit deeper with those more critical suppliers and rely on some automation tools and intelligence tools to do the rest. So they're trying to shift, like I said, kind of do the same with the same, or do more with the same or more with less for some of my clients. But no, I'm not surprised by this at all. And it's encouraging because everyone knows we've got to get a little more sophisticated in third-party risk in general to move it from manual to more technology enabled.
You know,
Well said.
can I hop in there, Peter, real quick?
Please do, Dave. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so a thought occurred to me when seeing that, not surprising to me either. I mean, of course, using automation and tooling, kind of prepackaged commercial off-the-shelf solutions is a great way to increase efficiency. And that's kind of part and parcel with what we're talking about here as far as budgeting. The caution that I would put out there for folks is there's a temptation to believe that somehow purchasing, let's say, 3 new tools to advance your third-party risk management program will just magically and suddenly show dividends. There's a lot of effort that goes into proper testing and implementation of these things, figuring out how to work them into existing processes and requirements, that kind of thing. So I guess the cautionary tale that I would put out there for folks is definitely do pursue those opportunities because they do exist and they are real. Just be careful with your expectations about how quickly you're going to see that ROI and really start to develop, because even the most kind of automated tooling is going to require, at the very least, some upfront resources to get it going properly.
That's a really good point you're making, Dave. And I also, want to acknowledge that that we did have responses in the survey suggesting that people were looking at outsourcing options and making that a priority, and augmenting their in-house resources with externalized resources clearly is a valid strategy. Ultimately, where are we going to get access to talent? And talent that has experience in being able to implement these new solutions is a critical need that many organizations will have. And so I think that combination is very powerful when we're able to leverage external and internal resources effectively to make the most of these tools that we're talking about implementing. We all know that projects ultimately fail when we fail to manage change effectively. It's the adoption, isn't it, ultimately, of the new tool and the new process that's the measure of success, rather than the tool in itself. So those things definitely stood out to me. But I wanted to pick up, Stephanie, on something that you said, which I think is really important, which is this idea that we're talking about moving from manual processes to more automation, but we're moving from data to intelligence, if I can put those words back into your mouth and say, what does that mean to you as you work with your clients? What does intelligence mean? And what are we really paying for when we're making investments in this area? What could we expect to get by focusing on this issue of increasing, shall we say, cyber risk intelligence in the organization?
Yeah, this kind of piggybacks off what Dave said, right? A lot of these tools can give you a lot of data, a lot more than you can handle sometimes. But the key is what do you do with that to turn it into intelligence or insights that your business stakeholders can actually action, right? I think the days of sending a report to a business stakeholder with, okay, here's a list of 15 findings that your third party needs to do X, X, and X, go do it, doesn't help them make decisions, right? We've got to translate that information into, yes, they've got some issues here compared to their peers in the same industry providing the same service. They're at par, they're okay. However, a couple critical areas, they're below their peers, or this is going to take a higher investment from your team. Translating that into business speak is what good cyber TPRM resources do. Instead of spending their time going and getting that data, doing all the assessments, they either get that from an outsourcing partner or intelligence tool. They're now spending that time turning it into quick intelligence that the business stakeholders and decision makers can use to get going. So that's what's happening. That's the demand from business executives, especially. They don't want a dashboard of findings anymore.
Well said. I think that was a beautiful example that you're giving there. And one thing that just struck me as you were speaking was how important it is that we get the support of the business to invest in this part of the business. And when it has been, shall we say, locked away in the, dare I say it, risk and security sort of silo, it's much harder to get the engagement from senior business executives who really need to lean in and support the ask that we are going to be making as executives and leaders in the risk and security space to protect the business. And I think one of the things that you just highlighted for me, Stephanie, was actually the relevance factor of why do we need this? Why is this important? Really is hinging upon our ability to represent this complex security environment in language that is understandable and consumable by business executives. And automatically that elevates what we're talking about to a high level in their minds. I was actually chatting with a CISO just yesterday who was telling me about the strength of their business relationship with the chief legal officer and the chief financial officer inside of their organizations. Interestingly, the TPRM function was housed largely in the legal organization. I'm not sure if that would be true for everyone on the call today, probably not, but some people are starting to see that's a place of alignment. And what was interesting about it is that person was now having a monthly meeting with the chief legal officer for their large organization to discuss issues associated with third-party cyber risk. And it was giving them a platform then to acquire the resources that they needed to run their program and to continue to develop it. So I think there's a lot to be said here for being able to use intelligent platforms or platforms that provide intelligence in ways that are translatable to the business environment. And I'm wondering, Dave, if that's something that you are also seeing through your own lens as you seek to raise the profile of the areas that you believe need to be invested in for the company. What's been your experience there in terms of what's been helping you get the attention of the right people who will help with that budgeting discussion that we'll be shortly talking about?
Well, I think you said it better than I could. Speaking to them, in their own language, helping them to understand the importance from the security perspective, but through the lens of and telling a story about business success and business outcomes. Most often the people who are, controlling the purse strings are not necessarily steeped in cybersecurity and technology. So going to them and saying, something about, APTs attacking SaaS vendors and infiltrating your infrastructure through cloud service providers, that's probably not going to get you very far. However, if you can translate that into what is the impact on business, if these risks that are observable and provable do actually come to fruition, I think you get a lot further along in the process that way. So I think you basically you nailed it. It's being able to communicate clearly what your security concerns are, the rationalization and the background information about those concerns, and the eventual risk outcomes or business outcomes that are associated with them in a way that can be understood by people who don't necessarily have the same background and experience as we do. It's
probably obvious to everyone, but when we're talking about budgeting, we're talking about numbers, finances, spreadsheets, and we're talking about financial organizations that ultimately review and approve budgets and the allocation of monies across the organization. So almost by definition, we have to get our headset around the fact that we're talking to people that are, shall we say, non-technical in nature, or certainly not security or risk biased in their normal day-to-day, and translating it into business value is really the key to our success. Now, I think we touched on this, Stephanie, you said it also, we're seeing the economic sort of constraints, meaning that people are being asked to do more within the bounds of what they are currently dealing with. So the question one could ask is, if your organization is either holding those budgets flat or even worst case, having to reduce costs, where can you find savings in your TPRM program without actually jeopardizing the security of your organization? Is it even possible? And what have you seen working for folks as they've tried to spend money in more intelligent ways to improve the overall security posture of their organization? Stephanie, what are you seeing working with your clients?
Yeah, so one strategy that I think works quite well is, and Dave started it when you asked him how do you kind of figure out your budget for the year is he gets to know what's going on in the business, right? So understanding each of your business units, what's their objectives, what's their plans for the year. A lot of them get funded for those projects. And, if I take a pharma organization that is heavily investing in a digital therapy, right? They're getting that funding. Getting in on those conversations is important because that's obviously going to require third parties. They're looking for that, different technology, those different ideas. That's going to trickle down to the third party risk team to have to give that perspective to them, get them to put it in their budget. Third party risk should be part of project budgets. If they're going to create more exposure, they should pay for it. So I've seen a good amount of our clients kind of getting a little more savvier with, everyone always puts IT budget line item, but what about the risk item? So that's a strategy to kind of find other alternative sources of funding, but it does really put the onus on the business because you've got to run the current work you have. And then when they're asking you to grow that run, they should contribute. I think a couple other ways people are getting smarter with their budgets is, I kind of alluded to it, they're kind of rethinking their risk appetite. So a lot of organizations have done assessments after assessments of suppliers, and they're getting some value out of that sometimes, but rethinking your framework, right? So we've assessed them 4 times in the past 4 years. They're in a pretty good posture. Do we need to look at them again? How do we change the amount of work we're doing for a set population and focus more effort on different populations? So I'm not saying you don't care about risk anymore, but really questioning how we viewed risk, how we viewed what was high risk 3 years ago. Is that still the same today, right? 3 years ago, data sharing with companies was less prevalent. Now, pretty much anyone you work with has some element of your data. So how do you get a little more granular, right? So it's becoming a little more ticked and tied in your process, and really rethinking what's important to you. If you no longer can have that supplier, what happens?
Those are 2 great thoughts. I'm going to pursue the first one in a moment. We'll talk a little bit about do we get to a chargeback model for TPRM? That's an interesting area to explore. But let's keep with that second thought, which is basically how do we get more intelligent about the way that we're spending our resources and where we're investing those resources? And I think that ties back to the need for an intelligence platform of sorts that will help us make those prioritization decisions. I think I saw some data recently that suggested that organizations are typically now trying to assess between 8 and 20% of their third-party ecosystem. Well, that begs the question, what are you doing about the other 80% or maybe even 92%, and how much exposure does that create for you? But I think everyone's faced with this issue of prioritization, aren't they? And I'm wondering, Dave, from your own experience, in a company that's growing but limited resources available to you in this particular area, what have you found effective as ways to make those prioritization decisions and have a level of confidence that you're actually focusing on the right third parties? As Stephanie says, do we just look at history and say, well, they were safe for the last 4 years, so we'll just, we'll put them to the side for the moment and focus on something that we have less intelligence or information around? Or are there better strategies? What advice would you be giving to our listeners today on that?
Yeah, well, just in defense of that particular strategy, what we find, at least from the outputs of standard kind of security questionnaire, security assessments, it is unlikely that any organization's security posture, as evaluated by those types of assessments, will decline over time. Generally speaking, there's a gradual growth in most security organizations. So I think that's probably the basis for that idea. If what you're doing is sending a static questionnaire over to your third party every year, you might find that it doesn't change very much, or if it does, it maybe gradually improves. It's not often that they're going to have multi-factor authentication in place and then stop doing that, for example. So I think that's the reasoning for that. Some of what we do internally is we have an annual process where we reevaluate or audit the efficacy and efficiency of any existing solutions or processes that we're using across the security program, including our third-party risk management program. The question that I pose to my team and those who are helping us perform these assessments is this actually producing the value and insights that are materially improving our security or risk posture? What I think we too often fall into is purchasing tooling or implementing processes that are perhaps a little bit more compliance focused rather than actual risk focus. And in some cases, certain organizations and high regulatory industries require some amount of compliance. But what I'm really getting at is all the stuff that we're doing security theater? Are we patting ourselves on the back for, dotting some I's, crossing some T's, checking some boxes, and feeling like, well, this will stand up in court, so I guess I've done my job? Or are we actually trying to improve our security and risk posture? And so taking that really hard line helps us to cut away some of the chaff and get down to what are the tools, the solutions, the processes that we have in place that are most impactful and effective. And so that can help you obviously reduce costs or shed some unnecessary cost. And the other piece of it is kind of what you already mentioned, is that strict prioritization. It's imperative that we know exactly what is most critical in our environments, what data, what business processes, understand those very, very well on the third-party risk management side of the house, and then set really clear expectations with the executives, the board, about what is realistic with regard to our capacity. We need to focus on those things that are the most critical. Obviously, we have to know what those are first. And you may say, look, all we are going to be able to handle are this level of criticality or inherent risk that's associated with this type of third party in our environment, and the rest are going to have to wait. Maybe we put them on some kind of a continuous monitoring, automated scanning tool, and we just look for blips or that kind of thing. And those are some hard questions that have to be asked. But if you simply don't have the opportunity to expand your resources, those are some of the trade-offs that we have to make, and they just have to be based on really strict prioritization.
Yeah.
I'll jump in on there a little bit, Peter. You were saying something about, questioning, is this really adding value, right? What we're doing here. So, some of our clients, and I'm seeing organizations, turn that finger around, right? So I've got a business process that relies on a third party. So we're going to go make sure the third party is secure as possible, right? And we're going to come up with all these things that they need to do to make me feel good. But more mature, I'll say, internal organizations are saying, well, how do I design my business process or my service to be less reliant on that supplier? Or can I give them tools to make it more secure? So how do we, kind of shift the not responsibility, but how do I essentially care less if that supplier has some type of cyber incident because of how I design my service? So there's a little bit of internal reflection happening as well to take some of the control back. And then, for a couple of my clients, they know that they're smaller, their supply chain's a bit smaller, or vice versa, they're pretty large, and they leverage a very small business supply chain globally. So they, instead of saying, hey, here's your findings, go fix this stuff, they're saying, hey, you've got some issues here. Here are some tools that we have that can help you. Here's how you set up MFA. We've got discounts with these vendors, and they're trying to almost provide that ISO consulting advice to the small businesses to help them improve as a different way to secure the supply chain versus kind of the go fix it. I'll be your partner and help you. So I'm seeing some alternatives to the traditional ways, which are very kind of exciting. So
it's exciting.
Sorry, what you were just talking about at the beginning of that statement there, this idea of, can we modify the business such that it improves security outcomes? And interestingly enough, just yesterday, I was on a call with a couple of hundred other CISOs. And one of the topics that came up is, have we shifted too far into this digital transformation, cloud migration, third-party vendor, excitement? Have we gone so far that we've actually lost some efficiencies, and we're not gaining those, specialized things that we need, and we're losing control over things that we need to have more control over. We're exposing ourselves to liability. So it's interesting, this evolution where, for the past 10 or so years, it's just been a mad scramble to just basically outsource as much as you possibly can to take advantage of these things, these economies of scale, that kind of stuff. And now people are starting to have those conversations that you mentioned of, maybe we need to pull some of that back in-house a little bit, or modify the way that we use these organizations that doesn't put as much dependence on them. So it's just been fascinating to watch that from an academic perspective.
I think it's even more than an academic perspective, isn't it? Because in this time of sort of economic hardship, if you will, it is making people think about, am I overextended? Do I have efficiencies built in? What do I need to consolidate? Are there fewer platforms that are more fully functional that I should be deploying rather than multiplying up the number of third parties, with the complexity of integrating them and ensuring that the data flows are adequate in that environment that give me, the single pane of glass, so to speak, to manage those supplier base. So it's a fascinating thing. The trending seems to be remorselessly down the path of more is better as far as third parties are concerned. But I think the more mature organizations are starting to question some of those assumptions and to challenge those internal processes and innovate in ways that you were just describing, Stephanie. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. The idea that at the end of the day, risk management is really about enabling our partnership, our relationship with our third parties to be a productive, safe, and secure one for both parties. We don't want to create risk for our third parties. We don't want them to create risk for us. How do we build that model more effectively? And to your point, the better equipped organizations are in a great place to help those smaller third parties who might typically be less well-resourced, may have less maturity in terms of their security models, and be able to benefit from, in some cases, incentivized services. I love that way that you put that. And I think in the spirit of continuing the conversation around sort of innovation, I wanted to come back to a point you made earlier on, Stephanie, around chargeback. Well, you didn't say that, but I was interpreting this idea of shared cost, or engaging business units to ensure that there was provision being made for their third-party risk management as part of the overall project funding. And it just made me wonder, do you think that there is a place for a chargeback model? Once upon a time, I remember a lot of IT costs used to be distributed in that way across the organization on a per user basis or some other basis. Is that something that you're seeing emerging in the third-party risk management space? What lessons have we learned so far, and what guidance would you give to those who might be considering that as a way of self-funding, perhaps the growth in spending that they really believe they need to be engaging in next year?
Yes, chargeback model ideas come up. I think they are appropriate discussions when you have a disproportionate amount of usage in your enterprise, right? So if, in financial services, if the wealth management function is got 80,000 suppliers and you're having to manage the risk of those, where, consumer lending has 2,000, right? So that, and a lot of times people just don't realize just the disproportionality among it until you show it. The reason sometimes chargeback models are attractive is because, third-party risk, cybersecurity, IT, it's kind of this homogeneous, large cost center. It's like a buffet, like a free buffet. Anybody can come in it. People eat more than others, but everybody gets what they want, and no matter what, the host pays for it all. So the people that are eating more, it kind of gets taken for granted. So when you're considering, looking at 6 suppliers for a service, and you ask the security team, go understand the cyber risk of all 6 of these, it's because they can eat whatever they want. Now, if you're starting to show those costs, they may be a little more selective or more open to different ways to see risk first. Like maybe we down select by using an intelligence tool before we go do a deep assessment. When they're seeing how much they're costing the organization, their behaviors might change. And if you push it and they have to pay for that, then their behaviors really change. The problem with when you don't have that type of model, and I would say chargeback models aren't super common. They're a little more common when IT is also a chargeback model, and where you do have this big disproportion. What what it causes is, these large buffets, everyone gets what they want. So the burden of meeting all of that demand comes to the TPRM program. The businesses are out there doing whatever you want. You're already resource constrained. And that's where we run into performance issues, because you're getting a lot of requests, a lot of asks. There's no reason they shouldn't. They can do whatever they want. And suddenly you're having performance issues. It's taking longer to get information to your business stakeholders. That's where that type of model, or even providing that cost visibility to the business leaders or the CFO, honestly, will start to help. But some of my clients do chargebacks and some of them don't. It just kind of depends on how it would fit with your culture and how volatile the businesses are.
I think that you made some very good points there. And one of them, I think, that stands out to me is the importance of transparency. When we're asking people to support what we're doing, which is essentially what the budget cycle allows for, we're explaining to them why we're making investments in different areas and why we need to see that investment changing for the upcoming period. Really, we're talking about disclosing to them things that they probably aren't thinking about the rest of the year. This is a one-time situation. Or why are you asking for a 20% increase in your budget when, when corporately we're trying to cut our costs overall? What's driving that? And in general, we're going to be pointing back to business initiatives that are causing these changes to occur, meaning that the IT department's not making this stuff up. This is actually happening because we're seeing business activity going on across our business units. And in some case, that it's a sort of all-you-can-eat model is all that the business can really cope with. But in other cases, as you say, what we really want is to have those business leaders acknowledge the importance of the program for them and be willing to support that effectively. And I think, there are very few CFOs out there who don't care about this. On the contrary, they care a great deal, particularly if they think a lot of money is being spent in this area, but they also have a sensitivity to risk. So really, the people you want on your side are the CFOs, because they're trying to make that equation balance. The fact is they're not well educated in third-party risk management and what that really looks like and how to make it work. So I think that kind of ties back to Dave's earlier comment about the importance of speaking the business language. But if we can focus on that early stage, as you put it, Dave, the identification stage, oftentimes, we ask people, can you give us a list of all your third parties? Not everybody knows who all their third parties are. It can take a bit of digging to get to it. But once you've surfaced that data, being able to then show the business the consumption of third parties seems to me, Stephanie, a real key to being able to have a more informed conversation about who's really driving the demand and where is that dependency within the business. So I love that thought. Dave, we're, as a company, not as large as many of our clients. Do you think about issues around chargeback? Is that relevant? Would you say to a sort of a company that's sort of what we might call a mid-sized company rather than a large enterprise? Is there a cut point where it becomes relevant? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't know. You're our chief marketing officer. Maybe we should talk about it after the call. Thanks, Stephanie.
Darn it! I do use a lot of third parties. I know I do.
I think it would depend, I think, pretty significantly on the culture of the organization. If I were just to suddenly say, we don't have any kind of chargeback modeling between business units currently in our organization, for me to just spring that on folks, I think would be a bit of a shock and probably not immediately accepted very well. It's the kind of thing that if culturally it seems appropriate, if it's a method and you don't have other methods by which to communicate those costs and have that transparency that you were just talking about, then it would be appropriate for me to then take that up to our CEO, CFO, and start having those kinds of conversations well in advance so that we could have the proper preparations for that. But I think there's also, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, other opportunities to measure and communicate those costs that are inherent in, for example, the increased usage of third parties. So earlier on, we were talking about a bit of a tightening of the belt, and in those situations, which portions of the organization are most likely to continue to receive funding or increases in budget, that type of thing. Obviously, the folks who are bringing in revenue are the ones that are top of mind. If they are bringing in revenue by virtue of engaging with more vendors and third parties for various types of services and solutions, that they're creating more work downstream, as Stephanie was just talking about, and that a la carte kind of buffet, which is, I'm definitely going to use that analogy in the future, system doesn't work, because you've got to find some way to illustrate that while one piece of the organization perhaps received additional budget, if another did not, but that other is required to expand at the same pace, there's a mismatch there. So whether it's through a chargeback or some other mechanism that you can use to clearly measure and communicate those costs, you've got to come up with it, regardless of the size or maturity of your company.
Well said. I think, given where we are in our conversation, I would like to move us forwards and talk about not just how we garner money, but how should we spend money? And in particular, two areas really stand out as significant. We talked a little bit earlier, we saw the poll results earlier on suggesting that headcount and staffing is one of the big nuts, and software and tooling is the second. So let's take one at a time. For capacity planning and headcount, what recommendations would you have to our audience today and as to how to think about allocating resources in the coming year? Maybe that's not about hiring a whole tranche of new resources. Maybe that's going to be extremely difficult. So it's perhaps more about where to focus their energy and their efforts and how to do that differently. And maybe that's where the tooling and the software tie together, where we can't ask them to do a different job unless we give them tools to be able to do that more effectively. Stephanie, what sort of guidance are you giving to clients at the moment about how to think about where to invest their precious dollars in these two areas of staffing and tooling?
Yeah. Well, usually if you can make your process more efficient through technology, then your current headcount could be used for more, I'll say, value-added activities. If you're unable to invest in technology, you might have to focus on additional headcount or using outsourced providers at a lower cost. If a client asked me to come in and, kind of what we say, an optimization assessment, right? One of the things we'll do is we will literally study how long it takes your resources, your people to do things. And then, we'll give those recommendations on if you implement this tool or you can modify this processor here, and we expect X hours of saving. Most people don't know how long it takes their resources to do things. And if you have a loose program where you don't have a good approach and a good framework, or you get a third party and you're like, I think it's risky, we'll do this. Like, they're going to spend a lot more time on things than they should. So do you have structure to make them more efficient and are enabling them to make decisions faster, really? So I think leveraging your existing headcount by understanding what they're doing and how well they're doing it and giving them the right tools is what I would advise on. And there's obviously, every organization has different constraints. So like, hey, staff, we have no tech budget this year. Okay, then let's talk about how do we make some of these processes. Maybe there's things they're doing they really don't need to do. Like, why have you guys been doing that? I don't know. Someone told us we had to do that 6 years ago. Okay, I don't think we got to do that anymore. So some very simple things and simple questions can lead to some big savings.
That almost sounds like a sort of zero basing idea, which says, well, let's strip it back and let's talk about, well, what do we actually have to get done? And maybe there are some things that we can put to the side and refocus. Both, whichever approach we take, it sounds as if one of the things we should be concerned about is education for our staff. If we want them to be effective in managing risk on behalf of the organization, should that be a line item in the budget going into 2023? Dave, what do you think about that?
100%. First, I want to say Stephanie took the words directly out of my mouth. That's 100% how I would do the whole capacity planning. Break that process down into chunks, determine how much effort it requires if it's performed by a human versus some kind of tooling, and then forecast your third-party inventory and see how much you need. So that's great. Education 100%. But what I would say about this, it's fascinating. I've had a lot of opportunities to work with people who have been in the business, since we called it information assurance, and folks who have just started, last month. And so different experience levels. And what I think is incredible, on most teams, you do have some range of experience and background. And you probably have some folks with a fair amount of experience who would be more than happy to pass on that knowledge to the less experienced folks on your team. The people with less experience may come in with some, kind of niche or specialized skill sets that they could pass on to the, the OGs, if you will. And so one of the things I would look at before I immediately jump to some sort of outside learning management system, certification process or something like that is, how much opportunity do we have to train and to conduct knowledge sharing just within our own environment, within our own program, such that the cost is time rather than it's sort of a financial expenditure.
That's a great point. Yes, we don't necessarily have to spend more to get a bigger bang for buck with the expertise that we've already gained and experience that exists within our teams, and thinking about motivating our teams as well as an important factor with regard to retention. Let's be honest, the war for talent is on. What is it that we're doing that would cause our people to want to stay within our organizations in order to continue to provide the services that we need? It seems to me that most times people say opportunities for growth and development are important to them, and to be able to be part of the next wave of solution as well. That idea of leading the innovation, bringing new solutions to the table can be very motivating from an employee retention point of view. So I'm glad that we got to the people factor, very important component for all of the folks on our call today. And we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you each for just a final question, just to get us to wrap up today. And that is really, what one piece of advice would you give to our audience as they present their budgets to their CEO or board or their CFO, whoever it is that gets to review and approve their plans? One piece of advice, Dave, from you, and then I'm going to come to you, Stephanie.
So it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about before, but I would say tell them a story about your third-party risk management program. Link the TPRM to business outcomes and risks. You can be real light on the technical details and more heavy on themes and reasoning. And I think for some organizations, if you've implemented already risk quantification or more of a quantitative method for measuring risk, then use that to talk about cyber and third-party risk, through the lens of dollars and cents. So again, like I was saying before, meet them where they're at rather than trying to pull them into your world.
Thank you, Dave. Stephanie, what would you guide our audience to be thinking about as they get to present their budgets this year?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd ask me first, because Dave kind of stole my answer. Tied to the business objectives, how is your program enabling business objectives is number one. I would say one thing that doesn't work anymore is fear tactics. This doesn't, if you don't fund this, the whole world's going to crash down. We're going to be, it doesn't work. So I wouldn't, there is the risk component, obviously, but aligning to your business objectives is probably a better way to go. I think a big piece of advice too is be honest with the situation. A lot of them don't realize that what the businesses are doing is putting a strain on your program. So ask for their advice. Like, hey, I want to support everybody, but you're not funding me, you're funding them, but indirectly, that's going to put more strain on us. So what should we do a little bit less? Kind of get their perspective on, if you're going to suggest that I need to say no to some things. Here are the things I think I should say no to. And are you aligned with me? Get the support. But business objectives number one.
I love that thought, Stephanie. And, exposing that idea of prioritization. Ultimately, you're making choices. We're all having to make choices about where to fund and what to fund. Exposing the thinking behind that priority gives those executives a chance to weigh in on, I think you should, up this level and down this level. It perhaps is an easier way for them to engage in the conversation. I think that's great advice, Stephanie. Thank you so much for that. And Dave, it's been a delight as always to have you in the conversation today. I think it's we're at time, unfortunately, so it's my chance to just say thank you to you both for the great commentary and insights that you've shared. I hope our audience has really enjoyed hearing those thoughts and it's triggered more. And we are always interested to hear from you as our audience. So thank you for spending part of your day with us. We do have a takeaway from today, which is a TPRM budgeting checklist that will pop up for you to grab. It will actually come into your email. So if you registered, obviously you registered for today's webinar, that is how we will reach out to you and provide you with our TPRM budgeting checklist to assist in your 2023 planning. This is part of a regular series of webinars. So until our next meeting, please look out for it. We wish you all very well indeed, and the best of luck with your 2023 budget asks. Thank you so much, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.